One comment. That's all it took. Not a rant. Not a heated debate. Just a single take that sounded confident in the moment and aged horribly almost overnight. Because what happened next didn't involve an argument, a clapback, or a social media war. It happened quietly, on the court, in front of millions. And by the time everyone realized what was going on, the damage was already done. This wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about being so sure you were right, that reality had no choice but to embarrass you. And it all started with a decision that shocked the basketball world. When Team USA's women's Olympic roster finally dropped, it wasn't the names that made headlines at first. It was the one name that wasn't there. Caitlin Clark. And the reaction wasn't some normal sports debate where people argue for a day and move on. This hit different because Caitlin wasn't just another talented rookie. She was the main reason a huge chunk of casual fans had even started paying attention to the WNBA in the first place. Her games weren't just popular. They were becoming appointment viewing. The kind of attention women's basketball has been chasing for years. So the second the roster came out, the conversation split in two directions. One side said, "This is the Olympics. You pick veterans. Period." The other side said, "You're leaving the biggest audience magnet at home, in the one moment the whole world is actually watching." And here's why that argument got so heated so fast. There actually were legit reasons on paper. Reports around the selection process emphasized experience, chemistry, and that the roster was largely built around players who already had years of international runs together. There was also the reality that Caitlin wasn't able to attend the USA basketball national team training camp in Cleveland after being invited, because she was still in the middle of Iowa's deep tournament run. And when she entered the WNBA, she had a rough adjustment stretch early. The physicality, the travel, the defensive pressure. It was the kind of welcome that makes even great players look human for a minute. So if you wanted to argue against her, you had talking points. But here's the problem. People weren't reacting like this was just a normal basketball decision. They were reacting like the league was stepping on its own momentum. Because the Olympics aren't only about winning. Team USA is expected to win. They've been the standard for decades. The roster was loaded with established stars, names that have been through this stage, players who've owned the league, veterans with medals, leadership, and a system they understand. And that's where the optics got tricky. If you're already the heavy favorite, why not use the spotlight to grow the game even more? Why not put the most watched player on the planet into the biggest global showcase? That's what turned the discussion into a wildfire. It wasn't just, does she deserve it? It became, are you serious right now? Then the TV debate started. And that's where one comment became the spark that lit everything up. Because Molly Qerim didn't tiptoe around it. She didn't say, I get why people are upset. She didn't say, this is complicated. She made the boldest version of the argument out loud. She suggested that giving Caitlin Clark a roster spot over someone more deserving would do something worse than upset fans. She said it could hurt the game. And not in a vague way either. The way it landed was basically, if you start selecting players because of marketing, attention, and storylines, you're turning women's basketball into a circus. You're making a mockery of it. You're telling real hoopers who've put in years of work that they're less important than a camera-friendly rookie. And when Molly framed it like that, it didn't sound like, I think it's too early. It sounded like, Caitlin isn't that level. That's why people reacted so strongly. Because she wasn't only defending Team USA's decision, she was attaching a bigger label to Caitlin Clark's value. And once you say it that way, you've basically challenged the one thing Caitlin can respond with. Not talk, not explanation, not a polite interview. Only one thing. Dominance. And the craziest part is, at the exact moment Molly said it, there were viewers who nodded along. Because on paper, you could justify it. Olympic rosters are tight. Veterans are proven. International basketball is different. Chemistry matters. But here's what made it a trap. Molly didn't frame it as a cautious opinion. She framed it like a verdict. And in sports, verdicts are dangerous. Because the second the player starts stacking great performances, people don't just say, you were wrong. They pull the receipt. They replay the clip. They bring the exact wording back. And once the clip goes viral, you don't get to escape it by clarifying. You have to live with it. That's why this wasn't a normal take. It was a bet. A bet that Caitlin Clark wouldn't become undeniable quickly enough for it to backfire. And the second that roster announcement became old news, Caitlin walked into the next phase of her season with a spotlight that didn't just follow her. It hunted her. Because now it wasn't just about whether she was good. It was about whether she was good enough to make that comment look ridiculous. And that's when things started moving in a direction nobody could control. Because the more pressure she faced, the less she talked. And the more she played. And once that happened, the entire conversation changed. What made Molly Qerim's comment so risky wasn't just what she said. It was when she said it. Caitlin Clark hadn't even finished her adjustment period yet. The league had barely figured out how to guard her. Defenses were still experimenting, switching, trapping, hedging, blitzing, trying to decide whether to pick her up at the logo or let her breathe and risk disaster. In other words, Caitlin was still in the part of her career where growth happens fast. And history is brutal to early verdicts. Every generational player goes through a moment where critics mistake adjustment for limitation, where physicality gets confused for exposure, where struggle is framed as proof instead of process. Caitlin's early WNBA stretch gave skeptics exactly what they were waiting for. Her shooting percentages dipped. Turnovers spiked as defenses collapsed on her. Opponents made it clear that stopping Caitlin was their entire game plan, and some analysts jumped on it immediately. This is a different level. She won't get the same looks. College dominance doesn't always translate. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. But the problem with applying that logic to Caitlin Clark is that she has never been a normal case study. From the moment she entered the national spotlight, her game has been built on solving problems in real time. Defenses adjust, she adjusts faster. Pressure increases, her vision sharpens. The more bodies you throw at her, the more openings she creates for everyone else. That's why framing her Olympic snub as protection of the game was always backwards. The WNBA wasn't just evaluating a rookie. It was being evaluated with her. Because Caitlin's presence forced uncomfortable questions. Why do some players get endless patience while others are expected to deliver instantly? Why is visibility treated like a threat instead of a tool? Why does excellence make people nervous instead of excited? When Molly said Caitlin would hurt the game, she unintentionally revealed a deeper fear, that attention changes hierarchies, that it exposes who thrives under pressure and who doesn't. And that fear wasn't about Caitlin failing. It was about Caitlin succeeding too loudly. Because if she did, it would challenge years of unspoken gatekeeping. It would disrupt comfortable narratives. It would demand acknowledgement that the league needed her just as much as she needed the league. And once that possibility existed, the take became a ticking clock. Either Caitlin would slow down, or the comment would age like milk. And the clock was already running. Caitlin Clark never publicly addressed the Olympic snub. No frustration. No disappointment packaged as professionalism. No subtle digs. She did something far more unsettling. She ignored it. Which sounds simple, but in a media environment that feeds on reactions, silence is powerful. It forces people to watch instead of debate. It shifts attention from talk shows to the actual product. And once Caitlin locked in, the game changed. Defenses started the game face-guarding her before she crossed half court. Bigs hedged high, terrified of her pull-up range. Help defenders cheated early, leaving shooters open just to prevent her from firing. At first, it looked chaotic. Then it looked calculated. Caitlin slowed the game down without slowing herself down. She stopped forcing deep shots and started bending coverage. She dragged defenders 5 feet higher than they wanted to be, then punished them with passes that arrived before rotations even began. Her turnovers dropped. Her assist numbers climbed. Her teammates started playing freer basketball. And that's when something subtle but important happened. Opponents stopped celebrating stops against her. They celebrated survival. Because even on nights when her shot wasn't falling, she controlled the floor. She dictated pace, spacing, and energy. Coaches started admitting that guarding her for 4 quarters wasn't realistic. It was about damage control. That's when the pressure flipped. Instead of asking, "Can Caitlin handle this level?" people started asking, "How much can one player bend a defense before it breaks?" And while debates still raged on TV, the league itself began responding differently. Crowds grew louder. Road games felt hostile. Every possession involving her carried tension. Caitlin wasn't just being watched anymore. She was being studied. And the more film teams gathered, the clearer it became. This wasn't a rookie riding hype. This was a player accelerating past the adjustment curve. Which meant that Olympic comment, the one meant to sound protective and rational, was now hanging in the air, waiting to be revisited. Because once a player reaches that level of control, conversations about deserving start to feel outdated. At that point, the only question that matters is impact. And Caitlin Clark's impact was becoming impossible to downplay. And once the box scores finally caught up to the eye test, the narrative didn't just shift. It flipped. There's a moment in every sports debate when talking becomes pointless. Because once the numbers start piling up, opinions don't get a vote anymore. That moment came faster than anyone expected. Once Caitlin Clark settled into the league's rhythm, the stat lines stopped looking like rookie progress and started looking like historical outliers. Not good for a first-year player. Not impressive considering the pressure. Just flat-out rare. And what made it uncomfortable for critics was how it happened. She wasn't padding numbers in meaningless games. She wasn't disappearing against top defenses. She wasn't being hidden late to protect efficiency. She was carrying the heaviest defensive attention in the league and still producing. Scoring nights stacked up quickly, but that wasn't what broke the conversation open. Plenty of players can score in bursts. What separated Caitlin was control. She wasn't reacting to defenses anymore. She was dictating how they played. Then the milestones started coming. Fastest rookie to reach scoring benchmarks that used to take entire seasons. Assist totals that rewrote expectations for a rookie guard. Games where she didn't just lead her team. She ran the floor like a veteran point general. And then came the nights that shifted everything. Triple-double performances that weren't quiet or accidental. They were loud, obvious, and undeniable. Scoring, facilitating, rebounding, all while being trapped before half court and chased off screens. Those games mattered because they killed the last safe argument. You can dismiss scoring as shot-making. You can call assists system-driven. But you can't fake command. And Caitlin was commanding games. Opposing coaches started post-game interviews sounding exhausted. Not angry. Not dismissive. Tired. Because game planning for Caitlin wasn't about stopping her anymore. It was about choosing which damage you could live with. Let her shoot from deep and risk a run, or blitz her and watch teammates feast. Either way, something broke. And the records kept coming. Youngest player to reach certain assist point combinations. Rookie benchmarks that hadn't been touched in decades. Firsts that forced broadcasters to stop saying, for a rookie altogether. At that point, the language changed. Analysts stopped comparing her to other rookies. Then they stopped comparing her to guards. Then they stopped qualifying the conversation at all. Because the truth had become uncomfortable. If Caitlin Clark wasn't talented enough for the Olympic conversation, then the definition of talent needed rewriting. And this is where the original comment became impossible to defend. Because the argument was never just about roster spots. It was about legitimacy. And legitimacy was now staring everyone in the face. Every highlight pushed the conversation further away from opinion. Every box score became another receipt. Every nationally televised game reminded viewers that this wasn't hype catching fire. It was substance proving itself, which created a new problem. Because when reality contradicts a confident take this hard, there are only two options. You double down and look detached, or you adjust and hope people forget. And that's when the tone started to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, carefully, because the numbers had done their job. And the next phase of the story wasn't about Caitlin at all. It was about how people responded when being right stopped being possible. The moment Caitlin Clark's numbers crossed into historic territory, something subtle happened. The volume went down. Not in the arenas. Those were louder than ever. But in the commentary. The bold certainty that once surrounded the Olympic snub started fading. Conversations that were once sharp became measured. Words that were once definitive were suddenly surrounded by context, nuance, and careful phrasing. And this is where the shift became impossible to miss. Because no one needed to bring up old clips. No one needed to argue anymore. The contrast was doing the work on its own. Molly Qerim didn't come out and repeat her original stance. She didn't double down and say Caitlin still wasn't that level. Instead, the language changed. The framing moved away from she would hurt the game and toward broader themes. Depth, opportunity, timing, respect for veterans. The message wasn't aggressive anymore. It was cautious. And that caution spoke volumes. Because when someone truly believes a take, they don't retreat from it once the pressure increases. They defend it louder. They reinforce it. They challenge the pushback. But here, that didn't happen. Instead, the tone softened. Comments became longer. Explanations became more layered. Certainty dissolved into clarification. And that's where the awkwardness came in, because viewers remembered the original wording. They remembered how strong the language was. They remembered how little doubt there seemed to be at the time. So when the narrative began shifting, it didn't feel like evolution. It felt like retreat. And that tension didn't go unnoticed, especially by co-hosts and fans who understood how sports media works. In this space, opinions aren't private thoughts. They're recorded, clipped, archived. You don't just move past them. You live with them. Which is why every attempt to reframe the conversation only highlighted the gap between then and now. The reality was simple. Caitlin Clark wasn't just meeting expectations anymore. She was exceeding the most generous projections. And that made the earlier concern, that she wasn't talented enough, feel increasingly disconnected from reality. The most uncomfortable part wasn't that someone got it wrong. It was how quickly the shift happened. Because it revealed something sports fans know instinctively. When the evidence becomes overwhelming, debates don't end with admissions. They end with silence. And that silence said more than any apology ever could. But this moment wasn't just about one analyst trying to recalibrate. It exposed a bigger pattern, one that shows up every time a player forces people to confront their own assumptions. And Caitlin Clark had become that kind of player. Which meant the conversation was no longer about whether Molly Qerim misjudged her. It was about why those misjudgments happen in the first place. And once that door opens, the story gets bigger. This situation lingered in people's minds for one simple reason. It felt familiar. Not just to basketball fans, to anyone who's ever watched talent get questioned before it was fully allowed to exist. Caitlin Clark didn't just walk into the WNBA as a rookie. She walked in as a contradiction. She broke the comfortable rhythm of how women's basketball narratives usually unfold. Normally, stars are eased in, celebrated quietly, and praised later. Caitlin arrived loudly, confidently, and already commanding attention. And that made people uneasy. Because when someone becomes unavoidable that quickly, it forces systems to respond before they're ready. It forces media voices to take positions early. It forces leagues to make decisions under a spotlight instead of behind closed doors. That's what made the Olympic roster conversation so charged. It wasn't just about who deserved a spot. It was about control. Who gets to decide when a player is ready? Who defines legitimacy? Who sets the pace for acceptance? When Molly framed Caitlin as someone who could hurt the game, it tapped into an old reflex, the instinct to protect tradition by slowing down change. That instinct shows up everywhere in sports. Young stars are told to prove it first. Innovators are told to respect the process. Game changers are told to wait their turn. But Caitlin didn't fit that mold. Her style was different. Her range was uncomfortable. Her confidence didn't ask permission. And instead of gradually warming people up, she forced an immediate reaction. That's why the backlash to the comment wasn't just about disagreement. It was about recognition. Viewers saw a familiar pattern playing out in real time. Someone being judged not on what they were doing, but on what others felt prepared to accept. And then Caitlin did something that made it worse for skeptics. She kept improving. She didn't plateau. She didn't shrink under pressure. She didn't fade into solid rookie territory. She expanded. Every adjustment made against her was answered. Every physical challenge was absorbed. Every scouting report eventually became outdated, which made the original concern feel less like analysis and more like anxiety. Because if Caitlin was this impactful this quickly, then the old frameworks for evaluation weren't just conservative. They were wrong. And that's the part people don't like to confront. This moment exposed how often media conversations are shaped by comfort rather than accuracy. By what feels safe to say instead of what might actually be happening. Once Caitlin crossed that threshold, the debate was over, even if no one formally declared it. And the silence that followed wasn't defeat. It was realization. Because sometimes the most revealing thing isn't what people say after being proven wrong. It's what they stop saying altogether. And by that point, Caitlin Clark wasn't just playing great basketball. She was forcing a reckoning. One of the quietest but most repeated fears surrounding Caitlin Clark had nothing to do with her jump shot. It was about attention. The concern was that she would dominate conversations, that she would soak up headlines, that everyone else would fade into the background. That was the justification hiding behind phrases like hurting the game. But once Caitlin fully settled in, something happened that critics didn't account for. The spotlight didn't narrow. It spread. Because basketball doesn't work the way people pretend it does. Stars don't exist in isolation. When a player bends the defense the way Caitlin does, the floor opens up for everyone else. And that's exactly what started happening. Defenders stopped helping late. Rotations came early. Entire schemes were built around stopping one player. And every time that happened, someone else benefited. Teammates who had never played in front of this level of attention suddenly had space. Guards found driving lanes they'd never seen before. Bigs got touches in rhythm instead of fighting for position. And the results followed. Players around Caitlin started posting career-best numbers. Efficiency climbed. Confidence followed. Games didn't just become more competitive, they became more watchable. That's the part that matters. Because fans tuning in for Caitlin didn't tune out when she passed the ball. They stayed. They learned names. They saw chemistry forming in real time. The narrative that one star would overshadow everyone else collapsed under the weight of reality. Caitlin wasn't erasing other players. She was introducing them. And that's when the original argument truly fell apart. If the goal was to protect the game, this was the opposite of harm. This was growth. Crowds got louder, not quieter. Road environments got more intense, not more polite. Games felt bigger, even when Caitlin wasn't the one hitting the final shot. Because her presence raised the stakes for everyone. And that's the irony no one could spin. The same attention that critics feared would cheapen competition ended up sharpening it. Players rose to the moment. Teams played with urgency. Matchups mattered. This wasn't a one-woman show. It was a catalyst. And once that became obvious, the fear that started this entire controversy lost its last remaining leg to stand on. Because if Caitlin Clark truly hurt the game, the results wouldn't look like this. They would look smaller. Instead, everything got bigger. And once people accepted that, there was nowhere left to hide from the truth. Go back to that original statement. That Caitlin Clark would hurt the game. That including her would cheapen competition. That talent and visibility couldn't coexist. Now compare it to what actually happened. Viewership climbed. Engagement surged. Conversations expanded instead of shrinking. The game didn't lose credibility. It gained momentum. And the most telling part wasn't what was said afterward, it was what wasn't. The confidence disappeared. The certainty softened. The criticism stopped sounding like criticism at all. Because when someone proves themselves this thoroughly, there's no clean way to argue anymore. No debate segment can erase performance. No clarification can undo receipts. No reframe can compete with history being made in real time. Caitlin Clark never exposed anyone with words. She let time do it. She let consistency do it. She let the game do it. This story matters because it's bigger than basketball. It's about what happens when certainty meets growth, when assumptions meet preparation, when someone is judged before being allowed to fully arrive. Caitlin Clark didn't demand belief. She earned it. And the speed at which she did that forced everyone watching to confront something uncomfortable. How often talent is questioned not because it lacks substance, but because it challenges expectations. In the end, no apology was needed. No argument was required. The scoreboard handled it, and history backed it up. Stories like this don't end here. Because sports aren't just about games. They're about narratives being built, tested, and sometimes completely shattered. If you want more breakdowns where hype meets reality, where bold takes are put to the test, and where the truth plays out in real time, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next moment like this is already unfolding, and you don't want to miss how it ends.